Hello, Nicole Mashburn, and today we're going to talk about the central nervous system, and in particular, the brain, its function, and some overall anatomy. So let's first talk about how the brain is protected. Remember, we're talking about the central nervous system, so we're talking about the brain and spinal cord. And if you remember, the brain is located inside the cranial cavity, inside the vault that your cranial bones make. And so the first protective layer is the bone or the skull. And so I've got this shown right here. You have your fat and skin layer over that as well. Now underneath the bone you have three membranes, something called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Mater basically means mother, so the dura mater is the tough mother, it's the outermost meninge. The arachnoid mater means spider mother, or it looks real spider web-like. And then the pia mater means tender, and it's the meninge that's right on in contact with the brain. So we have here you can see these different layers on your brain. These meninges help hold in a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and a lot of times you'll see it written CSF. And this is a liquid that it's kind of like plasma that's made by the choroid plexus. And your brain essentially floats inside a bag of fluid. And we have what's called a blood-brain barrier. So your brain's not sitting in blood, it's sitting in this CSF. Now you do have arteries and veins taking blood to and from the brain, but there's actually a barrier that doesn't allow some things to pass into the brain. For example, alcohol and nicotine can, because they're fat soluble, but any non-fat soluble things don't pass. So your brain's very well protected, and it's kind of isolated from the rest of your body. So just to kind of give you an overview of what this looks like, this is a sagittal cut of the brain, and you can see the different meninges. You have your dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, and all this blue stuff, this is the cerebral spinal fluid. So you can see the cerebral spinal fluid basically flows through all these little chambers and spaces. Even inside your spinal cord, you have the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's made by the choroid plexus, and if you remember those extra cells in your nervous system, those ependymal cells that have the cilia, they help keep that CSF moving through the central nervous system. So this is what you have, is you have this CSF that basically surrounds and bathes and supports and kind of floats the brain and the spinal cord. Some basic anatomy, you'll have an anatomy lab video. I just want to give you some basic anatomy. When you look at the brain, what we're talking about are three main parts, and that would be the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. And this colored region, this whole big thing is in color, is the cerebrum. And it has four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Again, you'll have this in your lab videos. I'm just kind of pointing it out now, so when I use these terms, you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about function, because we're going to talk about what part of the brain does what function. Your brain stem is made up of the pons and the medulla oblongata, and then if you remember your skull, you have a foramen magnum, a hole. Anything below the foramen magnum is spinal cord. And then your cerebellum is this little area that's kind of on the back and side and below the cerebrum. And again, we'll talk about this in a little more detail later. Your brain is also folded, and so you have these invaginations, and so the ridges that's a gyrus, and then the fissures, or the kind of the grooves, we call that a sulcus. And if you look at the brain, you'll see things called white and gray matter. So you have white matter and gray matter. And in the brain, in the cerebrum, and in the cerebellum, the gray matter is on the outside, and the white matter is deep on the inside. And if you remember, white matter just means that you have myelin associated with the axons of these neurons. So that myelin gives that material a white appearance. So let's kind of get into the function, because again, you're going to have a brain anatomy video, but the functions, these are some overall functions, and we're going to go into some more detail. Your cerebrum is the site of your conscious mind, so it's you. This is where you have awareness. This is where you perceive sensory awareness, okay? So sensory perception. So if you poke your finger and you have pain, you perceive that in your brain. You actually feel the pain in your finger, but you perceive that it's pain in your brain. It initiates voluntary motor movement. It allows us to communicate. It allows us to store memories, and it allows us to understand. And so we can put meaning to situations and meaning to thoughts. So it's you. So when you think about your personality, who you are, all of that's contained inside your cerebrum. The cerebellum is really for coordination. It helps you coordinate your motor skills and allows you to maintain balance. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then the brain stem is more of an automatic or reflex area. So you have head and eye reflexes. So for example, if you snap your finger and you kind of turn your head real quick. Breathing rate is controlled here. Your respirations. It's your sleep and wake cycles can be regulated here. And also it's a filter for sensory impulses. So as things are coming up from the spinal cord, they'll go through this brain stem, and they're kind of filtered out before they go on up into the cerebrum. So we'll talk about each section of the brain in a little more detail. So the cerebral cortex, remember that's that outer layer of the cerebrum. And this is a thin layer of gray matter. And this is where you have neuron cell bodies. And your brain is divided into two hemispheres. So you have a left and a right hemisphere. And so you've probably learned this in grade school. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. Well, the term we would use there would be contralateral. So your right brain controls the left side, it controls the contralateral side of your body. When you think about the cerebrum, it has three areas. It has a motor area, which is in control of voluntary movement. Has a sensory area, which allows you to be aware of sensation, pain, touch, smell, sight, sound. And then it has association areas. This is where we integrate information. So we associate, so maybe you smell something that doesn't smell good and you associate that with maybe a poison or something toxic or something you need to get away with. So we can give meaning to the information we receive. So when you're exposed to something, you'll store it as a memory. You can compare it to your present situation and decide if it's something you need to go toward or move away. For example, if you smell a rose, you may think of someone. It's a pleasant experience. If you smell a skunk, maybe an unpleasant experience. So we can associate things in our brain, make memories. So all of your conscious behavior uses your entire cortex. So again, the cerebral cortex is you. Now this is a neat picture. It's called a homunculus, and what it does is it illustrates in kind of a visual fashion how much brain is allotted for different either motor or sensory needs. So this is the motor map, so how much brain power you might use is used for motor, and this is the brain map for sensory. And it just shows you how much brain you're using for different things. So for example, your elbow here doesn't use very much brain power, because think about what the elbow does. Not much. It basically flexes and extends and pivots just a little bit. But look at your hand. You use a whole lot more brain power for the motor coordination of your hand than you do your elbow. And think about all the things your hand can do. Okay, so lots of coordination is needed, lots of power, brain power needed to control the hand. Again, the face is going to have more than the entire torso and body. Okay, so the face does so much. You're blinking, you're smelling, you're using your mouth, you're opening, you're chewing, you're talking. All of these motor movements that you do in your face takes a lot of brain power. And then the tongue. You use the tongue to eat and to speak, so it takes a lot of brain power as well. The sensory map. Again, you can see how much space, how much surface area is required for different parts of the body. And you'll notice that the face and your mouth and tongue, these require a lot. Think about vision and smell and hearing and taste. All of these senses, these are really, really high power senses that use a lot of surface area of the brain. Whereas your torso and your body, really that's just touch, and it's not all that complex. There's really not that much compared to vision and smell and taste. The foot and the hands have a little bit more than the entire torso. So think about if you're ticklish, maybe somebody tickles your back and you don't respond, but they tickle your foot, and you're really ticklish because you have a lot of sensory integration that's in your brain that's associated with your foot, and as well with your hands. Think about being able to read Braille with your fingertips, so you have a lot of sensory usage of your brain that's allocated to your hands. So that's called the homunculus. That's just kind of a neat way to realize that your brain's not equally divided amongst the sensory and motor allotment between your head, your feet, your arms, your legs, and your body. So this is a map of the cerebrum, and what we've done is we've mapped out certain areas that are responsible for certain things. And you can see we have motor areas, we have areas that are for memory. You can see there's areas for taste and sensation and vision and hearing. And I don't necessarily want you to memorize this chart, but I just want you to see that we have been able to map out the brain and which parts of the brain are responsible for doing what. And this is important because if someone comes in with a tumor or a metal object, or they've been shot or had shrapnel or any kind of brain injury, then you have a good idea about what may be affected. Or if someone comes in and all of a sudden they're not speaking anymore, or they can't see anymore, but their eyes are fine, you might have a really good idea that there's maybe a tumor or some kind of a lesion in a certain part of the brain. So say you fall and you've hit the back of your head really hard and maybe have a concussion on the back of your head and you can't see anymore. Well, it's not because your eyes aren't working, it's because this part of the brain has been damaged. And so they've mapped it out over the last couple of hundred years based on people coming in with certain brain injuries and tumors, and then associating that with a loss of function in that particular part of the brain. Two areas that are of special interest, I think, are neat, are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So Broca and Wernicke. And what Broca and Wernicke, these were two scientists back in the day. And what they started to notice was when people would come in with a lesion or damage in these areas of the brain, if it was this area, in Broca's area, it was named for him, they had lost the motor ability to speak. So they could understand you and you could talk to them, but they couldn't physically speak. And then Wernicke's area, he discovered that this was the sensory area and they could no longer understand speech. So even the written word. So words were just garbled. They had no understanding of the written word or the spoken word. So these are some association areas for language. Again, the motor being able to speak, and the sensory being able to understand speech. So again, they found this based on people having injuries and things like that. This is also something to understand. Have you ever known someone that had brain surgery? A lot of times they will keep you awake during brain surgery, so that as they're going in, they'll have you speaking or doing something so they can make sure as they're doing things in the brain that they're not affecting an area that they didn't mean to. So if you continue to talk, then they know that they're not affecting these areas of your brain, or if you can't see anymore, they're not affecting your vision areas. So that's one of the reasons that they keep you awake and kind of make sure they're not damaging other parts of the brain by making sure they're still working as they go into the brain. It's kind of a creepy thought, but that's what they do. So these are the things I want you to remember about what goes on where. So in the cerebral cortex, this is your sensory and motor association areas. This is where the EEG, the electroencephalogram, they measure electrical activity of the brain. And so if they're measuring to see if you're brain dead or not, this is the electrical activity that they're actually measuring is in the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobe, this is our area of personality, also concentration, and allows it to think and initiate movement and speech. Back in the day, when someone had a mental illness and maybe was crazy and uncontrollable, they would do a frontal lobotomize the patient, where they would take off the frontal lobe because that would affect their personality. And a lot of times that did more damage. It caused the person to be catatonic. They could just, they're just alive now with no personality. But that was a treatment at one time for mental illness. The parietal lobe, This is what we use to coordinate our senses. We use it to understand speech, to interpret size and shape and distance. So when I say coordinate senses, so if you ever notice if something smells and you know what it's going to taste like, so it kind of coordinates your smell and your taste and then other senses as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the special senses. Your occipital lobe is primarily visual. Now, a cool thing about the occipital lobe, it allows you to visualize, to recognize things. So if you see something, then you can make a memory and say, okay, next time I see a flag, I know that's a flag. So you store those visual memories there. It also allows you to visualize. So if I told you to close your eyes right now and think of the American flag, I bet you could do it. You're able to visualize it because you've already stored a memory of what it would look like. Your temporal lobe, this is for hearing. It's called the auditory center, and it allows you to understand sound, but it also allows you to think a sound. So if I said, okay, I want you to imagine what the Star Spangled Banner sounds like, our national anthem. So if you were to close your eyes and hum the Star Spangled Banner in your head, you would be able to come up with it because you can not only hear a sound, but you can think a sound based on the memories that you formed in the past. Now, one thing about the brain, the cerebrum, is we have what's called lateralization, which means there's a division of labor between the two hemispheres. And so we have basically the same structure on either side, but we have what's called cerebral dominance, where one side is more dominant than the other. And in most people, 90% of people, were left hemisphere dominant. And the left hemisphere is our language, math, and logic side. And so that's going to be, a lot of people are left side dominant. If you're right side dominant, that typically is people that have a lot of insight, I think artsy people, visual spatial skills, intuition. So that doesn't mean we don't use both parts of our brain. So there's many people out there who can do math and also draw. I'm not one of them, but there are people out there who can do that. It just means that we just typically are a little more dominant on one side than the other. So again, just because you're left brain doesn't mean you don't have insight or intuition or artistic skills. It just means you typically are more math and logic. So let's say Mr. Spock from Star Trek. What do you think he was? Yeah, he has a big old left hemisphere, lots of logic. All right, so again, our left and right hemispheres, they're not separate from each other. They do talk to each other. They can communicate because there are fibers that go between the left and right side. So the left and right side do communicate. And because they do that, this is also one of the reasons. So if you have brain damage, so maybe something happens on the left side and you've maybe lost the ability to do something, you can relearn how to do that because the right side can learn in some cases how to perform that function again. Okay, so the next part of the brain is the cerebellum, and it also has two hemispheres. You have one on either side, and it has these little ridges. These are the gyri, and in the cerebellum we call them folia, kind of like foliage, like a leaf. It almost looks like leaves of a book. Okay, so this is the cerebellum, and if you were to cut into a cerebellum, you would see that it has this unique shape, and this white matter makes something called the arbor vitae. So the white matter is the arbor vitae, and that's the medulla, the inside, not the cortex, the inside of the cerebellum. And we call that the tree of life, arbor vitae. And then where the cerebellum connects to the brainstem, we call those the cerebellar peduncles. These are basically tracks that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem so that it has a way to communicate with the brainstem. So what does the cerebellum do? The cerebellum, the cortex, calculates the best way to smoothly coordinate muscle contraction. All right, so it allows you to have a smooth gait. So when you're walking, then your cerebellum is basically smoothly coordinating this. People who have a stroke or tumor or cerebellar damage may still be able to walk, but they'll have an uncoordinated gait. So it allows you to have coordinated muscle contractions. It allows you to recognize and predict sequences in complex movements. So imagine you're out in the outfield of a baseball game and you're going to catch the ball and you see the ball coming and you're trying to figure out where to go. Your legs are moving, your hands are up to try to catch that ball. Your cerebellum is helping you coordinate all that and predict where you need to be and where you need to go to catch that ball. We use it in a lot of non-motor functions, word association, puzzle solving. So if you like Words with Friends or Candy Crush, then you probably do a lot of cerebellar processing because a lot of people that like games, your cerebellum is playing a big role in that. All right, some other parts of the brain, we call this the interbrain. It's also called the diencephalon, and this would be this region right here. So it's kind of the brain inside the brain. In the interbrain, the diencephalon includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So the thalamus is going to be this purple egg-shaped structure, and the hypothalamus is this W-shaped structure below the thalamus, and it connects using a stalk called the infundibulum to the pituitary gland. So if you remember, the pituitary gland sits inside the sella turcica, inside the skull. Pituitary is one of your endocrine glands, and we'll cover that a lot when we talk about 202. But the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, again, they're part of your endocrine control system. So the hypothalamus has a brain function as well as an endocrine function, and we'll talk a whole lot about the hypothalamus now and again in 202 in your second anatomy. Then the epithalamus, epi means upon, and this is this area kind of above the thalamus that contains the pineal gland. So what does the thalamus do? Well, I like to think of it as a post office. It's a gateway. It's the gateway to the cerebral cortex, and its function is to sort and edit and relay information. So as afferent information, so the information coming up from the body and the senses, goes through the thalamus, and even impulses from the hypothalamus and impulses from the cerebellum. They all go through the thalamus, and then the thalamus sorts it and sends it to the correct place in the cerebrum in order for something to occur. So then the cerebrum can get that information, integrate it, and make the decision about what to do about it. So it mediates sensation, it helps us with motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, memory. So again, it's very central. You need a thalamus because all this information is coming up to the brain, and it needs to be kind of sorted first and then sent out to the correct place in the cerebellum. The cerebrum, the cerebrum. The hypothalamus, big old homeostasis. That's what it does. And we'll talk about it a lot more later in 202. But the hypothalamus is your autonomic control center. So this helps you control those things that are automatic, like blood pressure, heartbeat, how fast your heart beats, how forcefully it beats, your digestive tract motility, how fast things are moving through your digestive tract. We use it for some emotional responses. It allows us to perceive pleasure and fear and range. It helps us with our biological rhythms and certain drives in our body, like sex drives, things like that. Regulates body temperature, food intake, water balance, helps us regulate sleep. It controls our hormones, it plays an endocrine function, and it actually even makes some hormones. And so not only does it control hormone production, but it also makes its own hormones. So it does a lot. So when you think hypothalamus, think homeostasis. It's one of the main master glands and master parts of your body that's in control of helping keep things in a homeostatic balance. And then the epithalamus has your pineal gland, and it makes melatonin, not melanin. So not the stuff that makes your skin a different color. Melatonin, which is a hormone, and that's a hormone that also is involved in sleep-wake cycles. So these are just some general functions of the different parts of the brain. Again, we'll cover some things in detail as we move into special senses, and then again we'll get into endocrine in our second course. So another part of the brain is called the limbic system, and it is an area that includes parts of the interbrain, the diencephalon, and parts of the cerebrum. And these are your emotional parts of the brain. And so these are parts of the brain that are working together. And one of these parts is called the amygdala, and it allows people to recognize an angry or fearful facial expression. It allows you to assess danger, elicit the fear response. So if someone's coming at you and they look all mean, that's your amygdala saying, "Ooh, that facial that facial expression is a scary expression. They mean me harm. I need to respond to that." The cingulate gyrus lets us express gestures. So when I did that, that's your cingulate gyrus helping you express emotion. So, smiling and frowning and things like that. So we use the amygdala to recognize expression and the cingulate gyrus to express emotion. It also allows us to put a response to an odor. So, for example, a skunk would smell bad. So if you smell a skunk, you maybe in the past someone told you, "Ooh, that's a warning when they spray. It's a warning." So you've associated that smell with something bad. Now, if someone had told you all your life, "Oh, that's skunk is the best French perfume you'll ever buy," then you may not have a bad association with it. But most of us see skunk, think bad. So you smell the skunk and you think something is bad. So these areas allow us to react emotionally to things. One thing I tell my students is children mimic us. And so if you wrinkle your nose at Brussels sprouts, your kids will wrinkle their nose at Brussels sprouts because it's a learned behavior. Because Brussels sprouts themselves are not bad or good. It just depends on how you feel about them. So you want to be real careful in how you put emotional responses to certain odors because sometimes you can pass that learned behavior on to your children. And then there's also your hippocampus and amygdala, and they play a role in memory. So this is just part of your limbic system. It's different parts of your brain working together to give us richness in our lives and emotion and things like that. All right, so another part of the brain is your brain stem, and it includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now, some books also include the diencephalon, and some don't. Our book, our class, is just going to say the brainstem is these three regions. So the midbrain is called the mesencephalon, and this is an area that is involved in reflexes, moving your head, and eyes. So if you hear a sound, your eyes and your head automatically turn toward the sound. You have something in the midbrain called the corpora quadrigemina, and you'll see this in your lab videos. And these have your visual and auditory relay centers. So they're involved with that reflex movement for your head and eye, like when you hear something. Or if you see something, you kind of jerk your head around. Your pons is your respiratory center. Your medulla oblongata is a reflex center, used for coughing and sneezing, vomiting. It has centers to help regulate your cardiac, your heartbeat, your breathing rates. In the medulla oblongata, it joins the the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. So when you're looking on your lab information, medulla oblongata becomes spinal cord at the foramen magnum. And then these pons and medulla oblongata and midbrain, they all work together and form something called the reticular formation, and they play a role in sleep as well. So your brainstem has a lot of automatic functions that it does for you. Okay, well that's all I've got today. So thank you for your attention, and I will see you again in another video.